أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اذكروا الله ذكرا كثيرا آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى صلوا على محمد وعلى آل محمد. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse of the Holy Quran, He addresses the believers when He states, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu dhkurullah. O you who believe, remember Allah, udhkurullaha dhikran kathira, a plentiful remembrance. Essentially, if we were to translate this verse of the Holy Quran into a bit of a simpler language, we come to an understanding that remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a lot is beloved to Him Azza wa Jal. What does it mean though to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a lot? Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu dhkurullaha dhikran kathira. And is a lot or quantity better than quality in terms of building out our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And you have two different opinions when it comes toward this notion amongst various Muslim scholars of ethics and spirituality. Some who state that the more that you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more that you tire your body through acts of prayer and dua and acts of worship and otherwise. And that through that exhaustion of the body, the soul and the heart has the capacity to elevate. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Should I try again? I could hold the other one if it's better. I don't mind. The first school states that exhausting oneself and their body allows for the soul and the heart to elevate toward a higher level of awareness and understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So through exerting ourselves in a great deal, for instance, standing the entirety of the night in prayers, sleeping very little, exhausting ourselves in Umrah and in Hajj or during the month of Ramadan, all of that is a manifestation of remembering Allah Azza wa Jal a lot. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu dhkurullaha dhikran kathira, and God commands to that manifestation or that type of remembrance. The other school says no, that rather, instead of exerting oneself too much, we may not have a meaningful connection with God during the course of the process. You can read a lot, but not understand what it is that you're reading, or you can read a little and do your best to comprehend what it is that you're reading. And the same goes with any sort of relationship that we have during the course of our lives. Sometimes you can be present with your family and with your children, and sometimes you can be mentally present with your family and with your children. Physical presence is good, but if you're watching TV and on your phone, your conversation with your children are going to be that much more limited than if you are spending a little bit of time, but entirely focused in that attention or an attentiveness to our family. So the second school of thought suggests that this verse of the Quran, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu dhkurullaha dhikran kathira, does not refer toward a lot of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala via ritualistic acts of worship, but it is rather a sense of quality in terms of that relationship that we build with Allah Azza wa Jal. And truly, when you come toward various ahadith of the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, you actually see that both of these are encouraged. On one level, of course, to be attentiveness when we're reciting Quran, when we're making dua, when we're engaging in obedience and worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is really, really good, and probably more preferred than spending lots of hours in ignorant worship or obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that being said, that does not mean that spending a lot of time in God's remembrance is always a bad thing. Because like we said before, the body has a direct correlation and link with the heart or with the soul. And that through that tiredness of the body, we become a little bit more aware of our spiritual potentials and capacities. The best example of that is during the month of Ramadan, like we said earlier. When we're fasting for 16, 17 hours during the course of the month, every single day, your body is so tired, but you see that your heart and that your soul and that our internal beings, they elevate toward a state of awareness and God consciousness, unlike at any other time during the course of our lives, or during any other time during the course of any given year. The month of Ramadan is meant toward being a symbol of what it means toward physical exertion and how that has the capacity to elevate. Anyhow, I say all of this because for most believers and for most people, regardless of the fact of whether they are believers within this religious tradition or not, we've long sought toward understanding and navigating how to live a spiritual lifestyle in a physical world. And we often struggle toward finding this balance between quantity and quality in terms of our relationships, not only with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but with others as well. And God within the Holy Quran numerous times, the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, alayhimus salam, numerous times within their ahadith, they often speak about finding this notion of balance. Balance in a materialistic world, but at the same time cultivating something that is metaphysical, meaning something that cannot be understood by these physical senses. So for today's discussion, insha'Allah ta'ala, I wanted to reflect upon how we can find balance in this physical world, but by maintaining a sense of spirituality in three different dimensions. The first dimension is in terms of understanding what are the qualities or the characteristics of a physical world. Secondly, what do we mean when we say a spiritual world? And thirdly, how do we find spirituality in the physical? So let's jump right into the first dimension of the discussion. When we talk about a physical world, what exactly are we talking about in the first place? When we talk about a physical world, we're essentially speaking toward the fact that human beings love things that are materialistic. And not to sound cliche, but we live in a physical world in order to sustain these bodies of ours. And when we see our bodies as the be-all, end-all, final goal, and ultimate objective of who and what we are striving to become, we recognize that there's a lot of harms and pitfalls toward that notion. And you see that in the world today. So many are fearful of speaking about of injustices that are taking place across the world because they're worried about their bank accounts. They're worried about work. They are okay to press a button that is going to lead to the violence of so many people across this world because they realize that if they don't press that button, God forbid, it's going to result in their failure in terms of how they understand prestige and success and so on and so forth. And social psychologists have long called this particular struggle that human beings have toward finding happiness and joy and contentment in this physical world as the hedonic treadmill. The hedonic treadmill is a term that is attributed to the fact that human beings, they're consistently running after the next thing that they believe is going to make them happy. So for instance, I believe that driving X car is going to make me happy. Once I get X car, I'm going to be happy, and then no longer thereafter will I have any more desires for this transient, materialistic, physical world. Until what? Until I get X car, and I'm driving one day down the LIE, and I see someone else driving Y car, and I say, you know what? In a couple of years, I'm going to drive Y car, and when I drive car Y, that is actually what is going to bring me happiness. This hedonic treadmill that human beings go through during the course of their lives has plagued everyone from the first of humanity, and it will undoubtedly plague us until the end of times. But it's so important to acknowledge, number one, that this is a reality that so many of us experience. Let me give you an example. This treadmill is not only limited toward adults, but it also is very evident in the lives of children. And as we go through various different stages during the course of our life, only thing that we want is something bigger, a little bit shinier, and a little bit faster. So for instance, when we're a child, we believe that the first time that we get $1 bill, it's going to bring us so much wealth and happiness and joy. Until a few years later, we realize that $1 is actually not worth that much. Then when we get our first $50 bill, we think we're rich, until we realize that $50 is not that much. We fast forward, we get $1,000 in our bank account, and we feel joy and happiness, only when you realize $1,000 is not that much. 10, 100, 200, 250, a million, it doesn't make a difference. We are never happy or content with what it is that we have if we believe that physical things are going to bring us happiness and contentment. That is essentially the problem that most human beings often fall to. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, has a response to this. He states, أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبِ, that there is something that is going to bring you happiness, and there is something that is going to bring you joy, and that is the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That when you realize and remember that it's not about this physical, transient world, but rather about something far better and far greater, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of these temporal pleasures are temporal pleasures, and we can enjoy them, and we can be happy with them. But if we believe that they are the ultimate source of happiness and of joy, we're going to be in a big problem. So this physical, or desire to feed the physical materialistic world, is that again which plagues the majority of humanity. And you see that individuals who don't believe in God, and I'm not limiting it toward the religious tradition of the religion of Islam, but people who totally neglect God or spirituality more broadly, studies have shown that, for instance, their relationships are far poorer. Meaning that their relationships with their spouse, with their family, with their children, with their co-workers, and so on and so forth, they are far poorer in terms of their relationship with themselves even. You take a look, for instance, at someone who sees the be-all, end-all of his life as this physical world. Now, not to try to speak toward matters of politics, but the best example of that in the contemporary world is someone like Elon Musk, right? Elon Musk says some wild, outlandish, outrageous things. And he consistently speaks toward this notion that, for instance, he is going to live on this world forever. And the only thing that is going to bring happiness and success and joy is work, and the money that comes along with work, which is why he would famously state that when he was initially manufacturing Tesla vehicles, no knock on Tesla vehicles, by the way, that he would spend hours of his night awake working in the factory. And anyone who was not with him working those long hours, he said that they're not going to be successful, and they were fired immediately, to the detriment of his relationships with others. When we see the physical, materialistic world, again, as the ultimate objective, we realize, again, that there's not much happiness in it unless we see it as a means toward an end. And that brings me then to the second dimension of the discussion. We recognize that this physical world is not the be-all, end-all, ultimate goal nor objective. So then what does it mean when we speak toward feeding the spiritual, or the spiritual world? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a body, and He has given us a soul. We have a physical component as well as a spiritual component. The body needs food, and the body needs drink, and the body needs sleep, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, the soul also needs certain things which are going to bring it a sense of joy and of happiness and of contentment, and so on and so forth. And total neglect of one over the other creates a lot of issues and a lot of problems. But over here, we see that there are studies that have been taken in the year 2020, for instance, that stated that upwards of 30% of Americans, they consider themselves spiritual but not religious. Some of you may have never heard of this phrase before, but I'm pretty sure that most people under 40 in this room, or under 45, they probably heard this term because it's super popular these days. In fact, a way that you can identify your religion today in many surveys, it'll be like, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, other, and it'll be spiritual but not religious in many, many surveys that are taken in the world today, or in this country at the least. that 30% of Americans, they consider themselves spiritual but not religious. And in accordance with the same study, that by the year 2050, the majority of Americans will consider themselves as spiritual but not religious. When they ask them, when they ask these, census takers or whatever, what do you mean when you say that you are spiritual but not religious? Or what does spirituality mean to you? They stated it in a couple of important takeaways. One of them was that spirituality to me means taking care of my neighbors. That spirituality to me means civic engagement, voting, and so on and so forth. That spirituality to me means going out and striving toward making a difference in the world that I'm living in. Even if we disagree with the fact that they were not religious, that this overarching theme of spirituality often connotes something that is incredibly positive. And that when you take a look at our religious tradition, it is overtly spiritual in the same way because we have certain core tenets that are built into it that commit toward those same actions, though we don't necessarily call them spiritual. For instance, Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar, enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. Now, over here you see core tenets that are obligatory actions within our religious tradition that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said if you don't perform them, you're committing a sin, and you have to perform them because they're a religious obligation, or also seemingly core tenets of someone who is spiritual but not religious. When it comes toward how we understand spirituality in the ahadith of the Prophet and of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, I want to read to you a report from Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali alayhi salam. Allahumma salli. He states in this famous sermon, Khutbat al-Muttaqeen, this famous sermon narrated by the Imam alayhi salam. Within it, he states this line about those who have taqwa, those who are spiritual, those who are God conscious. He states, يَأْمَلْ الْأَأْمَالُ الصَّالِحَاتِ وَهُوَ عَلَى وَجَلٍ. He states that they are those who, when they perform good deeds, they do it in a state of fear. A fear that perhaps it won't be accepted. Or a fear of perhaps that they could have done more. That they're never complacent in terms of their relationship with God or in terms of whatever act that they are committing to. And then he continues, alayhi salam. He states, وَيُمْسِي وَحَمُّهُ الشُّكْرِ وَيُصْبِحْ وَحَمُّهُ الذِّكْرِ يُبِيتُ حَذِرًا وَيُصْبِحُ فَرَحًا. He states, alayhi salam, that they are those when they perform good deeds, they do it with a bit of fear. And the last thought that they engage in before they go to bed every night is that they are in a state of gratitude. And they wake up every morning in a state of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When they go to bed, they're worried that they might not wake up. And when they wake up, they're happy that they have the opportunity for another day. Let's break this down to understand what Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam means in terms of how we can live this spiritual life in this physical world. The Imam alayhi salam, he states that when they go to bed every night, they go to bed and their last thought is gratitude. Imagine if every single one of us, and I remind myself, the last thought before we go to bed every single night is in a state of thankfulness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to truly count the blessings that we should be thankful to God for. Or even one manifestation of God's blessings that we are in a state of gratitude for before we go to sleep every night. Look, everyone has a tough life, right? We have to work really hard, a lot of traffic in New York, it's freezing outside, we have a whole host of various stresses. But at the end of the day, if every single one of us, we committed toward this act that the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam calls us to, which is to end the night in a state of gratitude, more likely than not, we're going to wake up in a good mood in the morning, as opposed to in a negative mood, stressed about all of the stresses that we encountered and experienced during the course of the day. Fair or not fair? Fair, I think. Over here, you take a look, for instance, just to open up one quick parenthesis. Right now it's really, really cold, and likely it's going to remain cold for the next God knows however many weeks into February and so on and so forth. And in a couple of weeks, the day after the inauguration of our president-elect, there's going to be a massive massive immigration and migrant crisis in our own communities, in New York City, and across the Northeast, and across this country. There are going to be thousands of people who are going to be living on the streets without socks, without gloves, without scarves, without hats, and it's going to be cold. So to remind ourselves of our small privileges, for instance, every night before we go to sleep, like that of heater, like that of a blanket, like that of socks, like that of X and Y and Z, all of a sudden it has the capacity to totally transform how we saw that given day, in spite or despite all of the challenges and obstacles that we encountered during that day. Yumsi wa hammuhu ash-shukr wa yusbih wa hammu al-dhikr. The Imam alayhi salam continues. At night, the last thought, gratitude. Their first thought in the morning is remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, how many of you don't necessarily like your jobs? You don't have to raise your hand for real. A lot of people will say, I don't really like going to work every morning, right? It's fair. I work on a college campus. I ask students all the time, do you like coming to class? They don't like going to class. In fact, students that have come and told me my own class, they said, look, we don't really care about your class, to be honest with you. We're just here for the 2 credits, and we're here for the easy A because we heard you're a easy grader. And I remember telling the student one time, I said, listen, I know you hate being here. Every day you come into the class, you come in and you are in such a bad mood. You sit in the back, you put on your hood, you pretend like I don't see you. Why don't you just come here with a little bit like more positivity? You'll be happier and I'll be happier to see your face every week. And they were like, how am I supposed to do that? I don't care about this. So I told them that remember that, like you said, I'm an easy grader. So after 16 weeks, you never have to see me again, and I won't have to ever see you, and you're going to get an A on your transcript. So who cares? All you have to do is show up with a little bit more of a positive mood. The next week, the student didn't come to class. 2 weeks later, though, he came to class. And he's like, and after the class, I called him, and I was like, hey, you know, how are you feeling? What's going on? And he's like, you know what? I realized that I thought that I just didn't like this class that much, but after that little talk, you know, I feel a lot better. What do you feel a lot better about? That maybe I'm going to learn something beneficial for my major or for whatever it is, so I'm just going to sit in the back and I'm going to come here with a better mood. I said, okay, great. Over here you see, in the words of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, alayhi salam, he states, yusbih wa hammuhu al-dhikr, that even if you hate that day, and even if you're not looking forward to any of those meetings or any of the people that you have to see or any of the appointments that you might have, yusbih wa hammuhu al-dhikr. If you wake up in the morning and you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you remember, hey, this is just a means to an end. This is all temporary anyway. Who cares? An appointment, I'm still going to go back home tonight and I'm going to sleep in my bed and I still have a heater and I still have food and whatever it is. At the end of the day, thank you so much. At the end of the day, it's going to bring us a little bit more joy and a little bit more contentment. Yumsi wa hammuhu ash-shukr wa yusbih wa hammuhu al-dhikr. Yubitu hadira. They go to bed at night with a sense of caution. Wa yusbihu faraha. But when they wake up in the morning, they feel happy and they look at the day and they see the opportunity that they have on that given day. Again, when someone has a mentality where they see the spiritual prior to the physical, it has the capacity to totally change and transform how we see life. And these same social psychologists, they have stated that individuals who see themselves as spiritual, or who tell themselves that they're spiritual, or who say that they're living for a higher calling, they're generally happier, they're generally wealthier, generally speaking. And at the same time, they are oftentimes more content, and the relationships run that much deeper than those who don't maintain a life of spirituality. And this brings me then toward the third dimension of the discussion. We recognize the challenges of the physical, and we recognize the benefits of the spiritual. How do we mesh that all together? And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He wanted us toward attaining that joy and that contentment and that happiness that is found internally, spiritually, then why is it that He created us and or presented us in this physical world? Couldn't have God just created us without bodies and we just souls roaming around in the earth or in the world or in the heavens or whatever it might be? Wouldn't that make a lot more sense? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to find joy and wants us to find contentment and says that it cannot be found in this physical world, then why does God place me in this physical world? And how exactly am I supposed to navigate it with all of its attractions and with all of its deviances? Number one, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us with a purpose. And that amongst these purposes is toward figuring out this existential question of how I am going to navigate this spiritual world or this physical world, though by a maintenance of my spiritual duties and responsibilities foremost. And it's hard. And no one said it is particularly easy. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states within the Holy Quran, إِنَّمَا أَمْوَالُكُمْ وَأَوْلَادُكُمْ فِتْنَةٌ. He states, for instance. That in another verse he states, وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا لَعِبٌ وَلَهْوٌ. And another verse of the Holy Quran, he states that الْمَالُ وَالْبَنُونَ زِينَةُ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. He states that your wealth and your children, they are an adornment of this world, something positive. And the next verse he states, إِنَّمَا أَمْوَالُكُمْ وَأَوْلَادُكُمْ فِتْنَةٌ. And your wealth and your children, they're a test for you. So they're an adornment, but also a test. What's the deal? And then at the same time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا لَعِبٌ وَلَهْوٌ. He states, and that what is this world except for play and amusement? And in another verse of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ. He says that He has fashioned with you, and He has adorned you, and He has blessed you with the blessing of a love for all of the desires of this world, and of wealth, and of ownership, and of property, and of etc. So we have the good, and we have the bad, all mixed into one. How do we figure it all out? There are 3 steps that I wanted to outline for us this evening. The first one of these steps, undoubtedly, that are preserved within the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, about how to navigate the physical world while with the maintenance of spirituality as the foremost goal and objective, is to make sure that we spend some time learning. Learning and answering these most existential questions that we have as human beings. What is my purpose in this world? Where did I come from? Where am I going? Why did God create me? Why did God create me today and not 1,000 years ago? Why did God create me today and not 1,000 years from now? Why did God create me with 10 fingers and 10 toes, not 11? Why not 9, for instance? Why did God place my eyes on my face and not on my feet? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create me to walk on 2 feet and not on 4 like other animals? Or not on their bellies like other animals? Why? I don't know the answer to these questions. But we are told to consistently increase our knowledge and awareness and understanding of questions like these ones through reflection and through contemplation. And through that, we have the opportunity to elevate in our knowledge and in our awareness, or otherwise what is known as ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you see that it's something that is seemingly so vivid and apparent to many people. You walk by a building and you see the building. And you walk by that building, you see the building, and you say, someone must have built that building. You walk by a chicken and you say, look at that chicken. Someone must have given birth, or another chicken must have given birth toward that chicken. You're walking by in the masjid, and in the back you see a baby sleeping on a stroller or on a car seat. And you say, look at the baby. Where did the baby come from? The baby must have recently been born to its mother and to its father. And then all of a sudden, you look up at the trees and the sun and the stars and the oceans and the rivers, and you ask the question, but there's no God, right? How could there be a God to all of that, right? It was all by chance. No. Rather that through deep contemplation and reflection, we are able to slowly be brought toward conclusions that draw us closer in terms of our understanding and of our awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And through that consistent reflection and contemplation, we are able to increase in ma'rifah while also understand some of those answers to those existential questions of what exactly and precisely is my purpose and my responsibility and my goals and my objectives in this world while I'm living over here for however many years that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created me to live in it for. To increase our knowledge through reflection. to increase our knowledge through reading and through study. We have the Holy Quran, and we have the ahadith of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen in al-Nahj al-Balagha, and we have the du'as of Sahifat al-Sajjadiyya, of Imam Ali Zain al-Abidin. And we have ChatGPT, right? We have like such an immense amount of information overload, quite literally at our fingertips, but like, sorry to say, we just don't read. People generally don't read. And retainment, by the way, I heard like all the ladies like laughing when I said ChatGPT, and none of the guys laughed, meaning that you all read and they don't, maybe, or the opposite. I don't. Oh my God, sorry. Or they're paying attention and the guys in front of me are not paying attention. Over here, sorry, it was just a joke, bad joke. Over here, we see that those who, for instance, like listen to podcasts, or those, for instance, who read information on ChatGPT, or who take a book and ask ChatGPT to summarize it for them, that their ability to retain information is far less than someone who actually opens up the book and reads the book. Over here, the first step that we need to take, undoubtedly, is to exert ourselves in increasing our knowledge. Number one, by contemplation and reflection, and number two, by spending time to reading and studying and to spending time with the legacy that has been given to us by Muhammadin wa Ali Muhammad. I'm so sorry. That was a terrible joke. I apologize. I apologize. And that brings me then toward the second stage, or the second step, in terms of how we can live a spiritual life while living in a physical world. And that is by our environment and our surroundings. That we see within the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam that tell us that if we want to be someone who has taqwa, then you have to hang around with people who have taqwa. You want to be someone who is educated, then you have to hang around with people who are educated. You want to be someone who has a relationship with God, then you hang around in the mosque. It doesn't mean that you do that all the time, at every second of one's day, but rather we find balance during the course of our lives. Oh, yeah. صلى على محمد وعلى محمد. To making sure that our environment is sound, such that we are able to grow with others during the course of the process. That's why, for instance, every once in a while, toward going for Umrah, for instance, and committing ourselves to being in the company of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to visit the Holy Kaaba, for instance. We have ahadith, for instance, that tell us that it is recommended to visit and perform Umrah once during every lunar month. If we can't perform it once every lunar month, then maybe once every lunar year. And if we can't do it once every lunar year, then maybe once every other year. Or do it the best that we can, such that, again, we're able to cultivate that sense of ma'rifah and awareness and being in an environment that reminds us of God and helps us aside or find an aside from all of the distractions that we go through during the course of our lives. Or toward the visitation of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. In a hadith from Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam, he states, Murru shi'atuna ila ziyarat al-Husayni alayhi salam. He states that convince and beg and encourage others, our Shia, to visit the grave of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam. And then he states, lil faqir fi sana marra, that during the course of 1 year, that for someone who is poor, that they should visit Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam at least once a year. Wa ala al-ghani marratayn, and that it is an obligation for those who are wealthy to perform it twice a year. Now, it doesn't necessarily read as a religious obligation, but as an encouragement, for instance, to do the best that we can. Because sometimes we need to get away from all of the distractions that we encounter and experience during the course of our lives toward going to those sites. And if we can't go to them, then we come to the mosque and we recite Dua Kumail. and we are in an environment that allows for us to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And since today is a day which we recollect the shahada of Ummul, Baneen, you see that an individual who is not ma'soom, doesn't come from a family lineage that is unique like that of other members of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, what allowed for her to reach and ascend toward this height other than the environment that she was in? She was in the house of Fatima. She was under the tutelage of Ali, in the company of Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein and of Zainab alayhim salam, that allowed for her environment to help her reach the highest of height and to reach the highest of rank that she has attained. And the third and final step that we can take, number one, to increase our knowledge through reflection and through study. Number two, to make sure that we're cultivating an environment or being in an environment that allows for us to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And number three, to link ourselves with the best of creations and toward the best of examples, and that is Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli Muhammad wa ali. That to utilize their example and to truly spend time studying their lives and to read their words allows for us to totally transform who we are internally, because they are the perfect examples of those who live this spiritual lifestyle in this physical world. The Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam also had stresses. They also had problems. They also had challenges. They also had to navigate and live through this physical world. And if sometimes we feel that their examples are too lofty, then take a look at the examples of their companions. Of people like that of Habib ibn Madahir al-Asadi, of people like Abu Dharr al-Ghafari, of people like Ummul Baneen alayhi salam, for instance. Regular individuals, again, who exerted themselves through their link. And again, it wasn't Ummul Baneen's physical proximity toward Imam Ali or toward Ahlul Bayt that allowed for her to reach the highest of height, but it was her spiritual proximity toward the Imams of Ahlul Bayt that allowed for her to attain this incredibly unique rank. And that through their example, we see, my friends, that we get the inspiration to make that difference within our own selves and within our communities as well. Let me give you this example. What allows for Baneen alayhi salam, the mother of Al-Abbas and her 3 other sons, toward reaching this such incredible station that we have Majlis for her every year, that people go and they visit her grave every day in Al-Baqi. Why? And what is it that again allowed for her to reach that highest of height? When someone gives and they try to make a difference in their communities, they can do so and they can give in 2 different ways. One can give through a means of that which is physical, and again, others can give by that which is metaphysical. Let me give you an example. That for instance, when we take a look at the example of, Thomas Edison. What does Thomas Edison give that allows for him to be amongst the most important, unique, transformational figures in history from the day that he, did what he did until this very day? What did he do? Yeah, electricity, right? He made a groundbreaking discovery to teach us how to utilize electricity that allows for us to live the life and the comforts that we live in every day of our existence. There are other individuals who also give, but give in a different way. Don't give that which is physical, but give that which is metaphysical. Let me give you an example. Nelson Mandela. Did Nelson Mandela give? Yeah, Nelson Mandela gave. Did he give something physical to the world? No. But he gave an idea that this apartheid, this racism that we're living under is incorrect. And we are going to stand up in all of our exertion against all of the manifestations of this injustice. And it allowed for an awakening of masses of people toward also standing for the same values and for the same virtues. When it comes to Baneen alayhi salam, what did she give? On one level, she gave the physical, and that was her 4 children, in honor and in service of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. And on the other level, she also taught us a value of that what it means towards serving and that what it means for sacrificing. Baneen didn't need to give her own life for her to be a means by which so many are inspired and draw closer to the family of the Prophet ﷺ, and by virtue closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But she gave the physical and she gave the metaphysical. Which is why on this day in which we recollect her martyrdom, in which we recollect her tragedy, of course Ummul Baneen's tragedy in and of itself was not her own, but it was the tragedy of Sayyid al-Shuhada al-Hussein alayhi salam. That she not for a moment thought of any benefit, nor of any success in this physical world, but rather the only thing that she sought was the contentment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and of the Prophet and his family in the world beyond this one. And this is demonstrated on that day when the family of the Prophet alayhi salam returns back to Medina after they made their final visitation toward Karbala. It is stated that Imam Ali Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, he alights from his horse after they enter into the city of Medina. And he goes to a man by the name of Bashir ibn Hadlam and states, "O Bashir, that your father was a poet, and he used to recite for my father Ali. Do you also recite poetry?" He says, "Yes, I do." He says, "Then recite some poetry in honor of the tragedy of my father Aba Abdullah." It is stated that Bashir ibn Hadlam, he stands next to the grave of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam outside of the mosque of Medina, Masjid al-Nabawi, in a nearby hill, and he begins to recite his famous lines of poetry. Ya ahla Yathrib, la maqama lakum biha. O people of Medina, this city is no longer worth living. Why, O Bashir? Because Hussein alayhi salam's body his head has been severed from his body. That Hussein alayhi salam has been martyred in Karbala, and he continues his lines of poetry until Ummul Baneen alayhi salam enters into his presence. And at this moment she says, "O Bashir, tell me, what did you say about the tragedy of my son Hussein?" At this moment, Bashir ibn Hadlam says, "O Ummul Baneen, my condolences to you on the tragedy of your son Abdullah." He wants to offer her condolences for everything that she had given. She says at this moment, "I'm not concerned about my son Abdullah. Tell me about what happened to my son Hussein." At this moment it is said that Bashir ibn Hadlam says, "O Ummul Baneen, condolences to you on the tragedy of your son Jaffer." She says, "I didn't ask you about Jaffer, tell me about Hussein." At this moment he says, "O Ummul Baneen, condolences to you on the martyrdom of your son Uthman." She says, "I didn't ask you about Uthman, tell me, akhbirni anil Hussein alayhi salam." At this moment Bashir ibn Hadlam, he begins to recite to her the tragedy of Al-Abbas alayhi salam. He says to her, "O Ummul Baneen, know that when Abul Fadl Abbas had got the water from the Euphrates, he was bringing it back toward the tents of Hussein. One man severed his right arm, another man from the left. At that moment, Hurmala struck an arrow that pierced his right eye. Another man struck his head with a dagger. At that moment, Abul Fadl Abbas was about to fall down from the horse. But normally when a man is about to fall down from his horse, he has his hands to protect him. But your son Abbas didn't have any hands, so he fell flat on his face." At this moment, Ummul Baneen says, "I know that if Al-Abbas fell, then I know what happened to Al-Hussein alayhi salam." At this moment, it is said that Ummul Baneen alayhi salam, she went directly toward the house of Zainab alayhi salam. And I know that today we're also remembering the 40th of a mother in our community. And over here, this is the way that Ummul Baneen came to grant Zainab alayhi salam condolences. It is said that Ummul Baneen goes toward the house of Zainab alayhi salam. She knocks the door, servant opens the door, and Baneen says, "I'm here to see your master Zainab." At this moment the servant says Zainab is in a state of grief and she's not seeing any visitors. Baneen says, "Then tell her that I am a partner in her grief." At this moment Baneen enters, and from a distance she sees Lady Zainab alayhi salam. She sees her battered, she sees her bruised, she sees her in a state of such grief and in such anguish. At this moment Baneen says toward Zainab, she says, "O lady, I'm looking for my daughter Zainab." At this moment Zainab says, "O my mother Ummul Baneen, do you not recognize me? Let me tell you what sacrifice happened to your son Al-Abbas." At this moment, even in that moment, Ummul Baneen says, "Don't worry about Al-Abbas, tell me about what happened to your brother Hussein." Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with grief in our hearts and tears in our eyes, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us a life that resembles the life of Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad, and a death that resembles the death of Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to never separate us from Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq, such that we can take inspiration from their words to live a spiritual life in the physical world. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept this majlis and to grant the reward of it toward Marhuma, Amina, Dhalla, and all of the Marhumin of Dhalla family. Rahim Allah man qara'a surat al-Mubarakat al-Fatiha.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Sheikh Faiyaz, dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Just a couple quick announcements. Tomorrow, madrasa will begin at 10:45 a.m. Tonight's Majlis and Niyaz is sponsored by the family of Marhuma Aminabai Dhalla to observe the 40th of her passing. Please recite Surah Fatiha for Marhuma Aminabai and all Marhumin of Dhalla, Per Muhammad, and Ladda families. In addition, tonight's recitation of Surah Yasin was sponsored for the Yuthana Thawab of the Marhumin displayed on the screen. Surah Al-Mubarak Al-Fatiha. Lastly, let us please recite 5 times the ayah of Amma Yujib for all those who are struggling here and around the world, including Sayyid Akbar Ali Rizvi, who is in critical condition in Pennsylvania. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. أَمَّن يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ 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 اللهم صل على محمد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. ماتم الحسين.
قبر حسین الوداع اہل وطن الوداع قبر حسین الوداع اہل وطن الوداع سید سجاد کا تھا یہ سخن الوداع قبر حسین الوداع وطن الوداع سید سجاد کا تھا یہ سخن الوداع ہوئی رعائی مجھے تربتیں بننے لگی ٹوٹی ہوئی ہڈیاں جسم سے ملنے لگی قبر حسین الوداع الوداع قبر حسین الوداع اہل وطن الوداع سید سجاد کا تھا یہ سخن الوداع قبر میں سب سونپ کے جاتا ہے یہ بے وطن شکر ہے معبود کا مل گیا سب کو دفن قبر حسین الوداع الوداع إلى وطن الوداع قبر حسين الوداع إلى وطن الوداع سید سجاد کا تائے سخن الوداع کرب و بالا توج میں ہی دفنا ہے کل قافلہ ماں پھوپھی بہنوں کے ساتھ صرف ہے زین العبا قبر حسین الوداع اہل وطن الوداع قبر حسین الوداع اہل وطن الوداع سید سجاد کا ٹھائے سخن الوداع بین یہ زینب کتا کرب و بلا سلام بھائی کو سونپا تمہیں کرب و بلا سلام قبر حسین الوداع اہل وطن الوداع قبر حسین الوداع اہل وطن الوداع سید سجاد کا تھا یہ سخن الوداع محمد وآل محمد صلوات السلام عليك يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة الزهراء سيدتي نساء العالمين السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين خصوصا سيدي ومولاي أبا الفضل العباس وأختك زينب وبنتك سكينة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام عليك يا مولاي يا غريب الغرباء السلطان أبا الحسن مولانا علي بن موسى الرضا كن شفيعنا وشفيع والدينا في يوم الجزاء وفقنا الله زيارتك يا مولا ورزقنا الله شفاعتك في الدنيا والآخرة السلام عليك وعلى أختك فاطمة المعصومة جميع رحمة الله وبركاته السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب الزمان سيدي الأمان 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 السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن السلام عليك يا إمامنا وإمام الإنس والجان ورحمة الله وبركاته برحمة وآل محمد صلوات
اللهم كل وليك الحجة من الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا وذليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرزك طوى وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.
Hello, Momineen, can you please empty this hall as soon as possible because the ladies have to come and have their dinner here.